The greatest lie in economic history is that tragedies bring only destruction. No, tragedy may bury millions in the ground, but it never kills opportunity. Sometimes it feeds that opportunity with blood and turns it into a monstrous giant. The Black Death, which crushed Europe and North Africa like a steamroller between 1347 and 1351, was the greatest cleansing operation humanity has ever seen. But this was not spring cleaning. It was a savage transfer of property, power, and wealth. Today I will tell you the dark truth grinning beneath that devastation. While some people were dying, others didn't merely survive. They climbed to the sky by stepping on corpses. This text is not just about the pain of the plague, but about the ice-cold fortunes extracted from that pain. The Black Death didn't just disrupt the system, it shattered it into its atoms. That lumbering structure called feudalism was built on the peasant's labor and the noble's sword. When the plague wiped out half of Europe's population, there were no hands left to wield the sword, no arms left to plow the land. But the economy, by its nature, abhors a vacuum. When an heir dies, property does not remain ownerless. It passes either to a distant relative waiting like a vulture, or to a cunning neighbor who managed to survive the chaos. Historians usually talk about mass graves. Let me tell you about emptied coffers. When your banking rivals die, when your competitors along trade routes are thrown into plague pits, your market share becomes 100%. This is exactly what the Black Death was, the largest and bloodiest sectoral consolidation in history, and who stood at the very top of this process. Of course, Florence's shining star, the Medici, masters of art and banking. But don't expect a romantic story. Giovanni de' Medici did not become great because he was a philanthropist. He became great because everyone around him was dead. At the beginning of the 14th century, Florence was dominated by the Bardi and Peruzzi families, untouchable giants of their age. But the plague touched them, and it touched them so thoroughly that both their human capital and their business networks were annihilated. What did Giovanni do? In 1397, before the dust of that financial wreckage had even settled, he dove straight in. His rivals' branches were closed, their managers dead, their client portfolios orphaned. Giovanni founded the Medici Bank in the middle of that ruin. Had the plague not wiped out the old aristocratic bankers, the Medici would likely have remained a middling merchant family lost in history's dusty pages. But the plague handed them an empty playing field. They seized control of the papal finances, held Europe's credit taps in their hands, and then paid for Michelangelo to carve statues to cleanse their sins. That magnificent artistic revolution we call the Renaissance was, in truth, a byproduct of the massive capital accumulation created by the plague. Michelangelo's hammer was forged with the inheritance of millions killed by the Black Death. Let's go to Milan. Things there were even harsher. The Visconti family did not use the plague as a biological weapon, but they managed the power vacuum it created with surgical precision. Imagine a city with a 60% mortality rate. What does that mean? Tens of thousands of properties, thousands of titles, and vast estates left without owners. Bernabo Visconti and his successor, Gian Galeazzo, became the sole masters of this heirless land market. As noble families died out, the Visconti absorbed those lands either under the guise of protection or by exploiting legal loopholes. A territorial unity that would normally have required centuries of warfare was achieved in a single generation, with the help of the plague. When they wore the ducal crown of Milan in 1395, Every jewel on that crown was the price of a hearth extinguished by the Black Death. Across the English Channel, the situation was somewhat more widely distributed, yet just as brutal. The class known as the English gentry, the small landowners, was essentially the illegitimate child of the plague. Take the Paston family, a modest, unremarkable household. But when the plague arrived, their neighbors in Norfolk died off one by one. What did the Pastons do? Instead of mourning, they ran to the land registry, or its medieval equivalent. They bought abandoned manors and untilled fields for next to nothing. Rather than squeezing the surviving peasants even harder, they hired them at low wages and turned their holdings into a vast landed empire. Likewise, the Neville and Stanley families rose to kingmakers by filling the gaps at the top of the aristocracy. Had the Black Death not mowed down the old barons, dukes, and earls, these families would never have been invited to that table. They were the winners of history's greatest liquidation operation. And what about those who had taken vows of poverty? This is where the irony reaches its peak. The Black Death turned the Catholic Church into Europe's richest real estate tycoon. Why? Because people are afraid when they are dying, and in that era fear was a commodity easily converted into cash or land. Imagine a dying nobleman, his entire family gone, his body covered in plague buboes. He fears hell. What does he do? I donate all my lands and mills to the church. Just pray for my soul. The church never refused such offers. When the plague ended, monasteries owned Europe's most fertile lands. The beauty of it, if one may say so, was that monasteries had no inheritance problem. Even if the monks inside died, the institution remained. Property didn't leak out. What belonged to the church stayed with the church. The magnificent cathedrals of medieval piety rose atop those donations, signed by desperate people on their deathbeds. Meanwhile, another game was being played in the Baltic Sea. Hanseatic League. Merchants turned the plague into a supply chain management exam. While Western Europe was collapsing under hunger and disease, these men controlled the grain, timber, and salt coming from the East. Did prices skyrocket? Wonderful. For a merchant from Lübeck or Danzig, that meant profit margins multiplied tenfold. Families like the Gossens and the Warendorps doubled their fleets while their rivals' ships rotted in harbors. For them, the plague was market cleansing and the opening act of monopoly. They sold the essentials of survival to the survivors at extortionate prices. Does that sound ruthless? Economic history remembers balance sheets, not mercy. Let's talk briefly about something good, though even it has a dark origin. The Black Death gave workers leverage for the first time in history. When half the population died, the surviving peasant said, "I won't work this land for the old price." In 1351, the English king tried to freeze wages with the Statute of Laborers, but it was futile. The law of supply and demand is stronger than a king's decree. Wages rose, serfdom began to dissolve, and social mobility accelerated. When a master died of the plague, an apprentice could take over a workshop without waiting 20 years. This was the great opportunity of small people. But remember that prosperity was made possible by neighbors buried in mass graves. One person's abundance was the result of another's annihilation. So, what does the Black Death teach us? This: disasters are not great equalizers, they are great accelerators. They multiply the power of those who are already strong, connected, and liquid. The weak are erased from history. There's no mechanical difference between the plague of 1347 and the financial crisis of 2008 or the pandemic of 2020. Then it was inheritance law and grain cartels. Today it is structured finance and tech giants. The rule is the same. When the system breaks, someone collects the pieces. And those who collect them are rarely the ones crying the loudest. They are the ones who move the fastest. History records the suffering of the dead, but the world is ruled by the bloody fortunes built by the survivors. The next time you look at a Medici palace in Florence or pass by a manor house in England, remember this: there is not only lime in the mortar of those stones. In that mortar lies the ambition of those who smiled quietly at their rivals' funerals.